When a man wearing a red Make America Great Again hat walked into Silverline Motors, no one paid much attention, except for the dealership manager, Rick Saunders. Rick had been in the car business for years and prided himself on running a tight ship. He believed in serving customers, but only the ones he felt deserved his attention. And in his mind, anyone wearing a MAGA hat was not worth his time. So when the man in the hat strolled into the showroom, looking at the luxury models on display, Rick shot a quick glance at his sales team. "Don't waste your time on that." "Guy," he muttered under his breath. The man continued browsing, occasionally stopping to inspect a vehicle. When he reached the reception desk, he politely asked, "Is the dealership manager available?" The receptionist, a young woman named Claire, hesitated. Let me check," she said, standing up. Rick, overhearing the request, shook his head. "Tell him I'm busy." Claire looked uncomfortable. "Are you sure?" He seemed serious. "Rick," scoffed, "I don't deal with those kinds of customers. He's probably just here to waste our time or start an argument." Claire reluctantly returned to the man. "I'm sorry, sir. Our manager is unavailable at the moment." The man didn't seem bothered. Instead, he smiled. "No problem. I'll just take a look around myself." He moved toward the high-end section where the dealership's premium vehicles were displayed. One of the newer salesmen, Jake, saw an opportunity. Ignoring Rick's earlier warning, he approached the man. "Hey there, interested in one of these models?" Jake asked enthusiastically. The man nodded, running his hand along the sleek surface of a luxury SUV. "Yeah, I actually wanted to discuss a business deal with the manager, but it looks like he's busy." Jake hesitated. "Well, if it's something important, I could try to get him to talk to you." The man smiled. "I appreciate that. By the way, what's your name?" "Jake." "Well, Jake, I like your attitude. You treat every customer with respect. That's how a business should be run." Rick, noticing Jake engaging with the man, frowned and walked over. "Jake, I told you not to waste your time." He turned to the man in the hat. "Sir, I don't think we have what you're looking for." The man raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what exactly am I looking for?" Rick folded his arms. "Listen, I can tell when someone is just here to browse without any real intention of buying. And to be frank, I don't think our dealership is the right fit for you." Jake looked, mortified. "Rick," but the man simply chuckled. "Interesting approach to customer service." Rick shrugged. "I run this dealership the way I see fit." The man nodded slowly. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. He handed it to Rick, who took it with a dismissive glance, until he read the name printed. On it, Jonathan Whitmore, CO, Whitmore Automotive Group. Rick's face turned pale. Whitmore Automotive Group was the parent company that owned Silverline Motors. The man he had just dismissed was not only his boss, but the highest authority over the entire dealership chain. Jake's eyes widened. Claire, who had been watching from a distance, gasped. Jonathan smiled. "You see, Rick, I don't just buy cars, I own the company that sells them." Rick stammered, struggling to find words. I didn't realize..." Jonathan held up a hand. "No need to explain. Your attitude already said everything." Silence fell over the showroom. The other salespeople stood frozen, waiting for what would happen next. Jonathan turned to Jake. "Jake, how long have you been working here?" About 6 months, sir." Jonathan nodded. "I like the way you treat customers. That's the kind of service I want representing my company." Rick's throat went dry. "Mr. Whitmore, Jonathan turned back to him. "Rick, I believe you've been managing this dealership for what, 10 years? Rick nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, and I've always..." Jonathan cut him off. "And yet, in just a few minutes you showed me exactly why this dealership isn't performing as well as it should." Rick swallowed hard. "I can fix this, sir. Jonathan sighed. "Rick, I don't have time for excuses. If you judge customers based on appearances instead of their value to the company, you don't belong in a leadership position. Rick felt the room closing in on him. Please, Mr. Whitmore. Jonathan turned to Claire. Call HR. Effective immediately. Rick is no longer the manager of this dealership. Claire's jaw dropped. Yes, sir. Rick's face turned red. You can't do this. Jake stood frozen, his mind racing. He had just gone from being a junior salesman to the manager of Silverline Motors in a matter of minutes. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. Claire approached him, her eyes still wide with shock. Jake, you just got promoted. The rest of the sales team murmured among themselves, some exchanging nervous glances, others looking outright impressed. Even the service technicians in the back, who had overheard parts of the conversation, peeked their heads out to see what was happening. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I don't even know where to start. Jonathan, now at the dealership entrance, turned back one last time. Start by proving that leadership isn't about power, it's about service. He gave Jake a nod, then walked out, leaving the entire showroom in stunned silence. Rick's departure had left an eerie tension in the air. Employees weren't sure if they should celebrate or be cautious. After all, change in leadership usually meant things were about to get shaken up. Jake finally found his voice. All right, let's get back to work, everyone. The team hesitated, then slowly dispersed, returning to their tasks. Claire remained at Jake's side, still trying to process everything. Jake, you realize this means you're technically my boss now? She said with a smirk. Jake let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, that's weird. She crossed her arms. So, what's the first thing you're going to do as manager? Jake thought for a moment, then looked around. He saw the way some employees still carried a bit of Rick's old mentality, prejudging customers, focusing only on high-value sales, and neglecting the importance of respect. He had a chance to change that. Well, Jake said, first, I think we need to have a team meeting. Things are going to be different around here. Claire raised an eyebrow. Different how? Jake glanced at the door where Jonathan had left and smiled. We're going to start treating every customer like they could own the place because, as we just saw, you never really know who's walking through that door. Meanwhile, outside the dealership, Jonathan climbed into his luxury sedan and took a deep breath. He had seen a lot of arrogance in his years of business, but there was something particularly frustrating about people like Rick. People who let their personal biases get in the way of good business. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Mr. Whitmore, a voice answered on the other end. How did your visit go? Jonathan chuckled. Well, I fired the manager and promoted a new one. A brief silence, then, that's one way to handle it. Jonathan smirked. I don't tolerate bad leadership. I want to make sure this dealership and all the ones under our company understand that customer service is non-negotiable. I understand, sir. I'll draft up an internal memo about customer treatment policies. Good. And keep an eye on this new manager, Jake. I have a feeling he's going to do great things. With that, Jonathan hung up, started his car, and drove off, satisfied that he had just set things right. As Jonathan drove away, he reflected on how often he had seen this kind of arrogance in leadership. Too many managers thought they could judge people based on appearances, forgetting that true success in business was built on relationships, respect, and a willingness to serve. Back at Silverline Motors, the reality of the situation was settling in. The employees were still whispering, some thrilled about the change, others uneasy about what it meant for them. Rick had been tough, but he also rewarded his favorites, those who followed his lead in dismissing certain customers. With him gone, they weren't sure what to expect. Jake, still adjusting to the fact that he was now the dealership manager, took a deep breath. All right, everyone, let's gather in the conference room in 10 minutes. We need to talk. Some of the employees exchanged nervous glances, while others looked relieved. Claire smiled. Good call. You need to set the tone right away. Tougher. Jake walked toward the conference room. He passed by Rick's old office. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, the desk was still cluttered with paperwork, coffee stains, and a few leftover reminders of the former manager's rule. For a moment, he hesitated. Just hours ago, he had been a regular salesman, following orders and keeping his head down. Now, he was in charge. Could he really do this? He took a deep breath. Jonathan Whitmore believed in me. That has to mean something. Inside the conference room, employees took their seats, murmuring among themselves. Some, like Claire, seemed hopeful. Others, like Todd, the second in command under Rick, looked skeptical. Jake stepped to the front and cleared his throat. All right, guys. I know today has been unexpected. A few chuckles. Claire nodded encouragingly. I won't lie. I didn't expect this either. But here we are. And I think it's time for a change. Todd leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. And what kind of change are we talking about? Jake met his gaze head on. A change in attitude. A change in the way we treat people. What happened today is a perfect example of why we need to stop judging customers before we even speak to them. The way Rick handled Mr. Whitmore, that should never happen again. Todd scoffed. Come on, Jake, let's be real. Do you really think every customer who walks in here deserves our full attention? Some people are just wasting time. Jake nodded. Maybe. But that's not for us to decide before we even speak to them. Claire jumped in. Exactly. If someone's here, they have a reason. And even if they don't buy a car today, how we treat them could determine whether they ever come back. Jake gestured toward her. That's the kind of mentality I want at Silverline Motors. We don't just sell cars, we build relationships. And we never know who we're talking to. Today, Rick assumed Mr. Whitmore was just some guy in a MAGA hat who wasn't worth his time. Turns out, he was our CEO. The room fell silent. Even Todd looked thoughtful. Jake continued, I don't expect everyone to change overnight, but starting now, we're going to treat every customer with respect. No matter what they look like, no matter what they wear, no matter who they are. Got it? There were nods around the table. Even the skeptical employees seemed to be considering the message. Todd sighed and finally shrugged. All right, boss, I'll give it a shot. Jake smiled. That's all I ask. As the meeting wrapped up, Claire nudged Jake. Not bad for your first leadership speech. He exhaled. I have no idea what I'm doing. She smirked. That makes two of us. But for what it's worth, I think you're going to be a great manager. Jake glanced back at the team, who were now dispersing with a new sense of purpose. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. Silverline Motors was about to become a dealership worth stepping into. As the meeting ended, Jake lingered for a moment, watching the employees file out. Some looked energized, while others seemed hesitant, still processing the sudden shift in leadership. He knew that trust wouldn't be built overnight. Claire stayed behind, leaning against the table. So what's next, boss? She asked with a playful smirk. Jake chuckled. You're enjoying this, aren't you? A little, she admitted. But seriously, what's the plan? You made a great speech, but words only go so far. You need to show people things are really going to change. Jake nodded. She was right. The culture of the dealership had been shaped by Rick's attitude for years. If he wanted real change, he had to prove it through action. First thing, Jake said, I want to go through all the pending customer complaints and service requests. I know Rick ignored a lot of people he thought weren't worth it. If we start fixing those issues now, we can begin rebuilding our reputation. Claire raised an eyebrow. That's actually a really smart move. Thanks, Jake said, pretending to wipe sweat from his forehead. Didn't want to mess up on day one. She laughed, then grew serious. You know, you're going to face resistance. Some of Rick's old crew, they liked things the way they were. Jake exhaled. Yeah, I know, but if they're not willing to adapt, they'll be the next ones out the door. Just then, an older gentleman walked into the dealership. His suit was a bit worn and he carried a thick folder in his hands. He glanced around uncertainly, as if expecting to be dismissed. Claire nudged Jake. This is your first test. Jake straightened his shoulders and approached the man with a smile. Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to Silverline Motors. How can I help you? The man hesitated. I came in a few weeks ago. I had an issue with my financing paperwork, but the manager at the time, well, he wouldn't even look at it. Jake felt a flicker of anger, but kept his expression calm. I'm really sorry to hear that. I just took over as the new manager, and I'd like to make things right. Can you walk me through what happened? The man's face lit up with cautious optimism. Really? That would mean a lot. Jake led him over to his new office, the same office that had belonged to Rick just hours ago. As he sat down at the desk, he felt a wave of determination. This was just the beginning. Silverline Motors wasn't just getting a new manager, it was getting a new future.